A guy in the elevator complained for 20 minutes about how incompetent and pathetic our CEO was, not knowing he was trashing the man standing right behind him. The elevator was packed when I stepped in on the ground floor of the Hendricks Financial Building, 11 other people crammed into a space designed for maybe 8, comfortably. I'd squeezed into the back corner, wearing jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, ball cap pulled low, just trying to get up to my office without the usual parade of handshakes and manufactured conversations that came with being recognized. It was 6:30 in the morning on a Monday, earlier than I normally arrived, specifically because I wanted to avoid the crowds and get some quiet work done before the building filled up. The guy who stepped in last, forcing everyone to compress even tighter, was mid-level management based on his department badge lanyard, maybe late 20s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from 3 years of steady promotions and 0 setbacks. His name tag read, Garrett Sullivan, Senior Operations Analyst. And the second the elevator doors closed, he started talking. He was on his phone, headphones in, but speaking loud enough that everyone could hear his side of the conversation, and he was absolutely eviscerating someone. The CEO, specifically. My company's CEO, me. He was saying, I'm telling you, man, this guy is the most useless executive I've ever seen. Complete fraud. Got handed the position because his dad knew someone on the board. 0 actual qualifications. The company's been coasting on momentum from the previous leadership, but this clown is running it into the ground. I watched everyone else in the elevator develop sudden intense interest in their phones, the floor numbers, anything to avoid acknowledging the supremely awkward situation unfolding. And I stood there in the back corner, baseball cap shielding most of my face, and listened to Garrett Sullivan explain in excruciating detail exactly why I was a worthless executive. I'd been CEO of Hendricks Financial for 3 years at that point, promoted from CFO when the previous CEO retired. My father had never known anyone on the board. He'd been a high school teacher, died when I was in college. But I'd learned early in my career that facts rarely mattered when someone wanted to believe a narrative. Hendricks Financial was a regional investment firm, about 800 employees across 4 offices, managing around $12 billion in assets for individuals and institutional clients. Not huge by industry standards, but substantial enough that the CEO position came with serious responsibility and serious scrutiny. I'd spent 15 years working my way up from junior analyst, earned my MBA while working full-time, built a reputation for turning around underperforming divisions. The board had selected me after a 6-month search that included external candidates, and my first 3 years had seen the company grow assets by 18% and employee satisfaction scores improve significantly. But none of that mattered to Garrett Sullivan, who was now explaining to his friend on the phone how I'd apparently destroyed morale company-wide. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. He said, everyone hates him, like, genuinely despises him. He shows up to work maybe 3 days a week, spends most of his time golfing or whatever rich idiots do, and then sends these condescending emails about accountability and performance. Meanwhile, he's cutting benefits, freezing raises, laying people off while he just bought his 3rd vacation home. The guy makes $8 million a year to basically do nothing. It's disgusting. Every single thing he'd just said was factually incorrect. I worked 60-hour weeks minimum, hadn't golfed in 2 years, owned one house that I'd bought before becoming CEO, hadn't cut benefits or frozen raises company-wide, and my compensation was a matter of public record at about $2.4 million annually, including stock options. But the conviction in his voice suggested he absolutely believed what he was saying. And more concerning, if he believed it, how many other employees believed the same things? The elevator was moving slowly, stopping at what felt like every floor. People got off in 1s and 2s, and with each departure, Garrett's voice seemed to get louder, like the increased space gave him permission to really let loose. By floor 8, when we were down to just 6 people including me, he'd moved on to specific complaints about recent company decisions. He said, and this new client onboarding system he mandated? Absolute disaster. Crashed 3 times last week, lost us 2 major accounts, and does he take responsibility? No. He blames IT, blames the implementation team, blames everyone except himself. That's what cowards do. They take credit when things work and deflect when things fail. The client onboarding system had been his own department's recommendation, which I'd approved based on their analysis and pilot testing results. When it had technical issues, I'd personally met with the IT team and the vendor to resolve them and had sent a company-wide email acknowledging the disruption and our commitment to fixing it. But apparently that reality had been transformed into a completely different narrative in Garrett's mind. By floor 12, we were down to 4 people, me, Garrett, and 2 women who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, but were apparently riding all the way to the upper floors. Garrett had shifted to personal attacks. He said, I've seen the guy exactly twice in 3 years. Twice. Both times he walked past me like I didn't exist. No eye contact, no acknowledgement. Acts like the regular employees are beneath him. And I've heard stories from people who've actually had to deal with him directly. He's apparently a nightmare in meetings, shoots down ideas without discussion, makes people feel stupid for asking questions. Classic narcissist behavior. I tried to remember if I'd ever actually encountered Garrett Sullivan in any context. Couldn't recall a single interaction. The company had 800 employees. I couldn't possibly know all of them personally. But I made a point of acknowledging people in hallways, learning names when possible, maintaining an open-door policy for anyone who wanted to discuss concerns. The idea that I was some distant, arrogant figure completely disconnected from staff was genuinely surprising. Floor 15. One of the women got off, practically fleeing when the doors opened. Now it was just 3 of us. Me, Garrett, and one remaining woman who was staring at the floor display with the intensity of someone willing the numbers to move faster. Garrett was building to something, his voice getting more animated, and I realized with creeping dread that he was going somewhere specific with this conversation. He said, "The worst part is, the board won't do anything about it. They're all buddies, all part of the same country club, same social circle. They protect their own. So those of us actually doing the work, actually caring about the company, we're stuck with this incompetent CEO while everything falls apart around us. Unless someone does something drastic." That last sentence made the woman's head snap up, made my attention sharpen. Unless someone does something drastic. Garrett noticed her reaction and seemed to realize he'd maybe gone too far, because he laughed and added, "I mean like organizing a formal complaint to the board or going to the press. Not anything crazy. But something needs to happen. The guy needs to be held accountable." The woman got off at floor 17, leaving just Garrett and me as the elevator continued toward the executive floors. And I made a decision in that moment that probably wasn't wise but felt necessary. I was going to see exactly how far this went. I'd come in early specifically to work on the quarterly board presentation in peace, planning to spend 3 or 4 hours alone in my office before anyone else arrived. The executive floor didn't fill up until 8 or 8:30 usually, which meant I had time. The elevator reached floor 22, the executive level, and the doors opened. Garrett was still on his phone, had moved on to discussing weekend plans with whoever he was talking to, and he didn't even glance at me as I stepped out. The doors closed behind me. I stood in the quiet hallway, security lights still on because the automatic systems hadn't detected enough activity yet to switch to full daytime lighting, and tried to process what I'd just experienced. My office was at the end of the hall, corner suite with windows overlooking the city, and a door that I'd kept literally open during business hours as a symbol of accessibility. I went there now, unlocked it, turned on the lights, and sat at my desk staring at nothing for a solid 5 minutes. Then I pulled out my phone and did something I probably should have done years ago. I searched for my own name on the company's internal message boards and anonymous feedback platforms. What I found made the elevator conversation seem mild by comparison. There were entire threads dedicated to criticizing me. Hundreds of posts, dating back almost 2 years, from employees at every level sharing stories about my alleged incompetence, arrogance, and disconnection from the company's actual operations. Some were vague complaints about leadership. Others were specific and detailed. Claims that I'd yelled at assistants, that I'd taken credit for other people's work, that I'd made discriminatory comments in meetings, that I'd fired people for personal vendettas. None of it was true. None of it. But the volume and consistency of the complaints suggested either a coordinated smear campaign or a massive failure of communication between executive leadership and the rest of the company. And the most disturbing part, mixed in with the obvious fiction, were legitimate concerns about company policies and decisions, reasonable criticisms that should have reached me through normal channels, but apparently hadn't. I spent 2 hours going through posts, taking screenshots, documenting patterns. Several usernames appeared repeatedly, clearly organizing the criticism and encouraging others to share their stories. One account, Concerned Employee 2024, had posted at least 50 times in the last 6 months, each post escalating in vitriol and absolutism. And the most recent post, from 3 days ago, said, "We can't wait for the board to act. They won't. We need to take matters into our own hands and force change. Organize, document, prepare for action." Reading it made my skin crawl, because take matters into our own hands, combined with Garrett's something drastic comment, suggested people were moving beyond passive complaining toward active planning. At 7:45, my executive assistant arrived. Monica Reeves had worked with me for 2 years, brilliant and organized, someone I'd trusted completely with sensitive information and complex scheduling. She knocked on my open door, saw me already at my desk, and looked surprised. She said, "You're here early. Everything okay?" I asked her to close the door and sit down. Then I showed her the screenshots from the message boards and told her about the elevator conversation. Her face went through several expressions: shock, confusion, anger, and then settled into something that looked like resignation. She said, "I've seen some of this. Not the message board specifically, but I've heard the rumors. About you, about the company, about executive decisions. I thought it was just normal corporate gossip, the kind of thing that happens anywhere." I asked her why she hadn't mentioned it to me. She hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw the answer. Because bringing negative rumors to the CEO about the CEO was a career-limiting move, because she hadn't wanted to seem like she was stirring up trouble, because she'd assumed I knew and was choosing not to address it. I told her I hadn't known, that this was the first I was learning about the scope and severity of employee sentiment, and that I needed her help figuring out how to handle it. Monica pulled out her tablet and started making notes. She said, "First question, is any of it true? The specific allegations about yelling at people, taking credit, firing for personal reasons?" I told her no, absolutely not. And if anyone had specific incidents they believed had happened, I wanted to investigate them immediately, because either I was missing something about my own behavior or someone was deliberately fabricating stories. Second question, she said, do you want to handle this internally or bring in outside help? I thought about that. Internal handling meant working with our HR department, which reported to me, which meant any investigation could be seen as biased. Outside help meant consultants or lawyers, which felt like escalation, but might be necessary for credibility. I told her to set up a meeting with our general counsel, Veronica Ashford, and our chief human resources officer, Richard Huang. Both were senior executives I'd worked with for years, both had reputations for integrity, and both would be able to advise on the legal and HR implications of what I'd discovered. Monica said she'd have them in my office within the hour, and then she asked the question I'd been avoiding. Do you think this is about actual grievances, or is someone orchestrating this? I didn't have an answer. Maybe both. Veronica Ashford arrived at 8:30, dressed impeccably as always, carrying her ever-present leather portfolio and wearing her lawyer face, neutral, analytical, prepared for problems. She'd been with Hendricks Financial for 12 years, general counsel for the last 5, and she'd navigated the company through multiple regulatory challenges and corporate disputes with impressive skill. She sat across from my desk, read through the screenshots I'd compiled, and her expression darkened progressively with each image. When she finished, she set her tablet down and looked at me with the kind of seriousness that meant she was about to say something I wouldn't like. She said, "This is legally problematic on multiple levels. If employees genuinely believe these allegations about hostile work environment, discrimination, and retaliation, we could be facing EEOC complaints, wrongful termination lawsuits, even criminal referrals if anyone claims witness intimidation or fraud. The fact that it's happening on company platforms means we have documentation of a toxic culture, which any plaintiff's attorney would love to get their hands on. And the references to taking action and forcing change could be interpreted as planning coordinated labor action, which brings in a whole different set of legal considerations." She paused. "But the bigger issue is, why didn't our monitoring systems flag this? We have compliance software that's supposed to detect this kind of content and escalate it to HR and legal. Either the system failed or someone actively circumvented it." Richard Huang arrived 10 minutes later, apologetic for the delay, explaining he'd been dealing with a benefits enrollment crisis in the Midwest office. Richard was in his mid-50s, had worked in HR for 30 years, including stints at 3 Fortune 500 companies, and brought a level of professional competence that had significantly improved our HR function since he'd joined 18 months ago. I gave him the same overview I'd given Veronica, showed him the screenshots, told him about the elevator incident. His reaction was different from Veronica's, less legal concern, more immediate anger at the content itself. He said, "This is character assassination. These aren't legitimate workplace complaints. This is targeted harassment designed to destroy your credibility and reputation. And the fact that it's been happening for 2 years without coming to my attention means either my team has been negligent or someone's been actively hiding it from me." He pulled out his phone and started firing off texts, presumably to his senior HR staff. "We need to do a full audit of every platform, every channel, every communication system. We need to identify who's posting this content, track patterns, and determine if this is organic employee discontent or coordinated malice. And we need to do it today, because if this goes external, if this hits social media or the press, the company's reputation will be in crisis mode." The three of us spent the next hour developing a response plan. Veronica would engage outside counsel to conduct an independent investigation, ensuring that any findings would be defensible and credible. Richard would audit the HR systems and interview key personnel to understand how this had grown unchecked. Monica would compile a complete record of every mention of me or executive leadership on internal platforms for the last 3 years. And I would do what I should have done years ago, actually walk the floors, talk to employees, understand what was happening in the company beyond the sanitized reports that reached my desk. But first, I wanted to know more about Garrett Sullivan. I asked Monica to pull his personnel file, his performance reviews, his departmental records. She had it within 15 minutes. Efficiency was her superpower, and what I found was interesting. Garrett had joined Hendricks Financial 3 years ago as a junior analyst, promoted to analyst after 6 months, to senior analyst after 18 months. His performance reviews were excellent. His managers consistently praised his initiative and analytical skills. His project outcomes were strong. On paper, he was exactly the kind of employee who should be fast-tracked for leadership development. But there was a note in his file from 9 months ago, counseled regarding inappropriate comments about senior leadership during team meeting. No formal disciplinary action, just a verbal warning and note in the file. The specific comments weren't documented, but the timing was interesting. 9 months ago was right around when the message board posts had started intensifying. I asked Monica to quietly find out which team meeting that referred to and who else had been present. While she worked on that, I went back to the message boards and started tracking Concerned Employee 2024's posting history in detail. The account had been created exactly 2 years ago, within days of a company-wide reorganization that had shifted some responsibilities between departments. The early posts were relatively mild, concerns about communication, questions about strategic direction, mild criticism of executive decisions. But they'd escalated steadily, becoming more personal, more accusatory, more willing to make unverified claims about my behavior and character. And about 6 months ago, The account had started actively recruiting others to share their stories, offering to help document incidents, suggesting collective action. Veronica, reading over my shoulder, said, "This feels organized. This feels like someone building a case for something specific. Maybe a wrongful termination suit, maybe a discrimination claim, maybe just trying to create enough negative sentiment to force a leadership change. The question is who and why." Richard pointed out that the timing of the escalation, 6 months ago, coincided with our last round of performance-based compensation adjustments, where about 15% of employees had received lower bonuses than they'd expected based on departmental and company performance. He suggested that might be the trigger, someone angry about compensation who decided to channel that anger into a broader campaign. Monica returned with information about the team meeting from 9 months ago. It had been Garrett Sullivan's department, a strategy session for the operations division, about 30 people present. Garrett had apparently made comments suggesting that executive leadership, specifically me, was out of touch with operational realities and making decisions that undermined the work his team was doing. His manager at the time, a woman named Judith Kramer, had pulled him aside afterward and given him the verbal warning that ended up in his file. And here's where it got interesting. Judith Kramer had left the company 3 months later, taken a position at a competitor firm, and her departure had been somewhat acrimonious with suggestions that she'd felt unsupported by senior leadership. I asked Monica to reach out to Judith and see if she'd be willing to speak with me off the record. Monica looked doubtful, but said she'd try. Then Richard's phone started buzzing with responses from his team, and his expression told me the news wasn't good. He said, "We've found it." The monitoring system was working, flagging potentially problematic content and sending alerts. But the alerts were being routed to a specific HR coordinator who was supposed to escalate them to senior management. That coordinator has been marking them as resolved without escalation for at least 18 months. Either they made a catastrophic error in judgment, or they were deliberately suppressing the information. Veronica asked who the coordinator was. Richard checked his phone and said, "Dennis Pembroke. Been with us for 4 years, generally solid performance. But now that I'm looking at his records more carefully, there are some concerning patterns. Multiple employees have requested to work with different HR reps, citing communication issues with Dennis. Several complaints about his responsiveness and professionalism. Nothing that triggered formal action, but in retrospect, red flags we should have caught." I asked if Dennis was in the office today. Richard confirmed he was scheduled to be in at 9. I told him to have Dennis in my office at 9:15 and to have security discreetly present in case things went sideways. At 9:12, Dennis Pembroke knocked on my office door, clearly confused about why he'd been summoned to the executive floor. He was in his early 30s, had the slightly disheveled look of someone who'd gotten ready in a hurry, and his eyes kept darting between me, Richard, and Veronica with growing anxiety. I invited him to sit, kept my tone neutral, and asked him directly, "Can you explain your process for handling flagged content from the employee monitoring system, specifically content related to executive leadership?" Dennis went pale. His mouth opened and closed without sound, and then he tried to recover. He said, "I follow protocol. When content gets flagged, I review it, determine if it requires escalation, and handle it according to guidelines." I asked him to be more specific about what he considered worth escalating. He said, "Credible threats, violations of conduct policies, harassment that meets legal definitions. General complaints and criticism don't typically meet those thresholds, so I document and monitor, but don't necessarily escalate unless there's a pattern." Veronica jumped in. She said, "And did you notice a pattern? 2 years of increasingly aggressive posts targeting the CEO, multiple accounts making specific allegations about misconduct, recent posts suggesting coordinated action. Does that meet your threshold for a pattern worth escalating?" Dennis's face went from pale to red. He said, "I made judgment calls based on my assessment of credibility. A lot of the posts seemed like typical workplace venting, not legitimate HR issues, and escalating every complaint would have created unnecessary alarm and potentially made the situation worse. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this." Richard, who'd been silent until now, said, "Dennis, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a truthful answer. Did anyone ever instruct you not to escalate complaints about executive leadership? Did anyone ever suggest that bringing this content to senior management would be problematic for you or the department?" Dennis hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. He said, "I may have gotten feedback at some point that executive leadership preferred to hear about solutions rather than problems, and that bringing them every complaint or criticism wasn't productive. It was never a direct order, just general guidance about how to manage information flow." I asked who gave him that guidance. He said he couldn't remember specifically, that it had come up in multiple conversations over time. Veronica asked if he had any written documentation of those conversations. He said no. Richard asked if he understood that suppressing information about potential hostile work environment issues or harassment put both him and the company at significant legal risk. Dennis nodded miserably and said, "I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was filtering noise and protecting leadership bandwidth for important issues. I didn't realize I was creating a bigger problem." Veronica and Richard exchanged glances, and I could see them making the calculation. Was Dennis a perpetrator or a victim? Had he deliberately suppressed information as part of some conspiracy, or had he been a low-level employee doing what he thought his superiors wanted? interpreting vague guidance in a way that served his own career interests? My instinct said the latter, which meant he was a symptom of a culture problem rather than the root cause. But he still needed to be removed from his current position immediately. I told Dennis he was being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into his handling of the monitoring system, that he should gather his personal belongings and leave the building within the hour, and that he would be contacted by our legal team regarding his cooperation with the investigation. He started to protest, then seemed to realize the futility, and just nodded. Richard escorted him out, and once the door closed, Veronica said, "That's not our mastermind. That's someone who made terrible choices but doesn't have the sophistication to orchestrate what we're seeing. We need to look higher." Monica knocked and entered without waiting, which meant something urgent had developed. She said, "Judith Kramer will talk to you, but only if you meet her in person, and only if you come alone. She's free for lunch today at a restaurant downtown, neutral territory. She says she has information about what's been happening but won't share it over phone or email." I checked my calendar. I had an executive committee meeting at 11 and a call with an institutional client at 2, but lunch was technically clear. I told Monica to confirm with Judith, clear my afternoon schedule just in case, and have a car ready at noon. The morning spiraled into controlled chaos. Richard's team uncovered more evidence of suppressed complaints and mishandled escalations, not just related to me, but to several other executives and managers. Veronica's outside counsel contacts started preliminary work on a comprehensive investigation protocol, and Monica fielded an increasing number of messages from various department heads reporting unusual employee behavior, hushed conversations that stopped when managers approached, increased use of private messaging apps, scheduled meetings with vague agendas that excluded leadership. Something was building, and whatever it was seemed to be accelerating. At 11:50, I left for lunch with Judith Kramer, drove myself in my personal car because the company driver would have drawn attention, and arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early. It was an upscale bistro in the business district, crowded with the lunch rush, anonymous enough that we wouldn't be easily noticed. Judith arrived exactly on time, looking professional and guarded. She'd been a senior manager in operations, well regarded, and her departure had been a loss for the company. We ordered, made small talk until the food arrived, and then she got to it. She said, "I left Hendricks Financial because I couldn't be part of what was happening anymore. I tried to work within the system, tried to address problems through proper channels, but I kept hitting walls. And eventually I realized the walls were intentional, that certain people didn't want problems solved because the problems served their purposes." I asked her to be specific. She said, "Garrett Sullivan. He's smart, ambitious, and absolutely convinced that he should be running things instead of the people currently in charge. When I managed him, I saw his potential, but also his arrogance. He came up with this theory that you got your position through nepotism rather than merit, and no amount of evidence to the contrary would change his mind. He started spreading that theory to others, recruiting people to his perspective, building what he called a coalition for change." Judith continued. "I tried to shut it down through normal management channels, verbal warnings, performance discussions, setting boundaries. But every time I pushed back, Dennis Pembroke in HR would somehow make the complaints disappear or minimize them. And then I started getting pressure from my own boss, suggesting that I was being too hard on a high-potential employee, that I should focus on Garrett's strengths rather than policing his opinions. Eventually I realized that Garrett had connections I didn't know about, that someone higher up was protecting him, and that my options were either play along or leave. I chose to leave. I asked if she knew who was protecting Garrett. She said, 'I have suspicions, but no proof.' What I do know is that about 6 months before I left, Garrett started talking openly about documenting everything wrong with executive leadership, about building a case that would force the board to make changes. He recruited other employees to contribute stories, coached them on how to frame complaints, promised them that eventually there'd be accountability. And the message boards were his platform. He managed multiple accounts, posted under different usernames, created the appearance of widespread discontent, even when it was really just him and maybe a dozen committed followers multiplying their voices." She pulled out her phone, showed me screenshots she'd saved before leaving the company, messages from Garrett to other employees, explaining his strategy. "We need volume. We need consistency. We need specific allegations that can't be easily dismissed. And we need to be patient. Let the narrative build until it reaches critical mass. Then we strike." The screenshots were damning, clear evidence of a coordinated campaign, but they were from her personal phone, which meant their admissibility as evidence was questionable. I asked if she'd be willing to testify or provide a formal statement. She said, "Only if you guarantee it won't blow back on me. I have a new job, a new career path, and I don't need Garrett or his allies coming after me. But I'm tired of watching him destroy people's reputations with lies, so I'll help if I can do it safely." I thanked her, promised we'd protect her identity to the extent legally possible, and asked one more question. What was Garrett's endgame? What did he actually want? She said, "Initially I think he wanted your job, or at least a path to it. He saw himself as the future of the company, young and innovative and unencumbered by the old guard's timidity. But when it became clear that wasn't going to happen through normal advancement, he pivoted to destruction. If he couldn't have the position, he'd destroy whoever did. and he'd build his reputation as a crusader for employee rights and corporate accountability in the process, which would serve him in whatever came next. I drove back to the office processing everything Judith had told me, the pieces clicking into place with disturbing clarity. Garrett Sullivan had spent 2 years orchestrating a campaign to destroy my reputation and potentially my career, using company resources and platforms, manipulating other employees into participating, and evading accountability through a combination of HR dysfunction and protective relationships with someone in management. The question was, what to do about it? Going after him directly would look like retaliation, play into his narrative about vindictive leadership, but doing nothing meant allowing the campaign to continue and potentially succeed. Back at the office, I briefed Veronica and Richard on Judith's information. Veronica immediately flagged the legal complications. We need to build an airtight case before taking any action against Garrett. If we move too quickly, he claims whistleblower retaliation, and we're defending multiple lawsuits. We need documentation, witnesses, evidence of actual policy violations that justify termination or discipline, independent of the content of his complaints. Richard added, and we need to shut down the false narrative while protecting the legitimate concerns that might be buried in it. Because even if 90% of what's on those message boards is manufactured or exaggerated, there's probably 10% of real issues we should address. Monica had been compiling data while I was at lunch, and she presented it now. Garrett Sullivan had accessed the employee message boards from his work computer 487 times in the last 6 months, far more than any other user. He'd posted under at least 7 different usernames that she could identify through writing style analysis and timing patterns. He'd sent over 200 messages through the company's internal communication system to various employees, many of them containing talking points that later appeared in message board posts. And he'd scheduled or attended at least 15 meetings with groups of employees from different departments, ostensibly about professional development, but possibly serving as recruitment or strategy sessions. The pattern was clear. What we needed was the smoking gun, something that definitively proved Garrett's intent and methods in a way that would withstand legal scrutiny. Veronica suggested we get IT involved, have them do a forensic analysis of Garrett's work computer and accounts to document his activities. Richard suggested we interview some of the employees Garrett had been messaging, see if any of them would confirm what Judith had described. I suggested we do both, and also that we bait a trap. Here's what we did. I drafted an email to the entire company, scheduled to send the next morning, announcing that I'd become aware of concerns circulating about executive leadership and company direction. I said I took these concerns seriously, that I was committed to transparency and accountability, and that I was establishing multiple channels for employees to raise issues directly with me and senior leadership. I included specific contact information, promised confidential handling, and invited anyone with concerns to use these channels rather than anonymous platforms where misinformation could spread unchecked. It was designed to look like a good faith response to employee discontent, but it was actually a test. Would Garrett see it as leadership capitulating to pressure, or would he recognize it as a trap? Monica sent the email at 7 a.m. By 8:30, Garrett had posted on 3 different message boards, celebrating it as a victory and encouraging employees to flood the new channels with complaints to overwhelm the system and prove how widespread the discontent was. He also posted a message that was particularly revealing. This is them trying to control the narrative before it goes public. Don't let them. Keep documenting, keep organizing, and when the time is right, we take everything we have to the media. They can't ignore us if we go external. That post gave us what we needed. We take everything to the media established that Garrett was planning to damage the company publicly, which violated his employment agreement's confidentiality and loyalty provisions. Veronica confirmed that we now had grounds for immediate termination, with cause that wouldn't be vulnerable to retaliation claims. But I wanted one more piece before pulling the trigger. I wanted to know who Garrett's protector was, who'd been running interference for him with HR and management. Richard's investigation had narrowed it down to 3 possibilities, all senior managers in different divisions who'd interacted with Garrett and might have had reason to shield him. We needed to identify which one before proceeding, because if we terminated Garrett without addressing his enabler, we'd solve one problem while leaving the systemic issue intact. So we set up another trap. I scheduled one-on-one meetings with each of the 3 managers, ostensibly to discuss Q4 planning, but actually to mention casually that we were investigating employee misconduct on the message boards and expected to take action soon. Then we waited to see who tipped off Garrett. It took 6 hours. The 3rd manager I met with, a divisional VP named Stanley Crawford, who'd been with the company for 8 years and had a reputation as a skilled political operator, had his meeting at 2 p.m. By 8 p.m. that evening, Garrett had posted on the message boards warning that management was planning retaliation against employees who'd spoken out, urging people to document everything and prepare for legal action. The timing and specific language made it clear Stanley had warned him, which answered our question about the protector's identity. Now we had 2 targets and a clear sequence. Terminate Garrett for cause based on documented policy violations, then investigate Stanley's role in protecting him and potentially obstructing HR processes. Veronica drafted the termination letter, Richard prepared the documentation package, and we scheduled everything for first thing the following morning. But before we could execute, Garrett made one final move that accelerated the entire timeline. He went to the media. Specifically, he contacted a reporter at the local business journal who covered corporate governance and workplace issues, a woman named Rachel Kim, who'd built her career on exposing executive misconduct. He gave her a full interview detailing his allegations about my incompetence and the company's toxic culture, provided her with screenshots from the message boards, and positioned himself as a brave whistleblower, risking his career to expose the truth. The reporter, to her credit, contacted our media relations team for comment before publishing, which gave us about 12 hours to respond. Veronica, Richard, and I worked through the night preparing a comprehensive rebuttal. We documented Garrett's campaign with timestamps and forensic evidence. We showed the pattern of false allegations and coordinated manipulation. We demonstrated that legitimate employee concerns had multiple channels for resolution and that retaliation protections were in place. We provided context for every specific allegation Garrett had made, with evidence showing they were either false or grossly distorted. And we released it all, to the reporter, to the board of directors, and to the company's employees, at 6 a.m. the next morning, 2 hours before Garrett's interview was scheduled to publish. The Business Journal updated their story before publication, incorporating our evidence and completely reframing the narrative. What had been scheduled as an exposé of executive incompetence became instead a story about employee manipulation and corporate investigation of misconduct. Garrett's interview was still included, but now contextualized with evidence that many of his claims were fabricated or exaggerated. The reporter even interviewed Judith Kramer, who'd agreed to go on record after seeing Garrett's media gambit, and Judith's account of his calculated campaign was devastating to his credibility. Garrett arrived at work that morning to find security waiting at the entrance, with instructions to escort him to a conference room. Richard, Veronica, and I were already there, along with a witness from HR and the forensic evidence of his activities. We presented him with the termination letter, the documentation of policy violations, and the findings of our investigation. He tried to bluster, tried to claim whistleblower protection, tried to threaten legal action. Veronica calmly explained that whistleblower protection requires the disclosure to be truthful and made in good faith, neither of which applied to his fabricated allegations and admitted media strategy. He was terminated effective immediately, escorted from the building, and banned from company property. Stanley Crawford's fate took slightly longer to resolve. The investigation into his role revealed that he'd been protecting Garrett because Garrett had information about Stanley's own performance issues, specifically that Stanley had been inflating his division's numbers and misrepresenting client satisfaction data to make himself look better for promotion consideration. Garrett had discovered this, and instead of reporting it, had used it as leverage to ensure Stanley would protect him from HR consequences. The investigation found sufficient evidence of Stanley's misconduct to justify his termination as well, which happened 3 days after Garrett's. The aftermath rippled through the company for months. The message boards were shut down and replaced with moderated platforms that had proper oversight. The HR department underwent a complete restructuring with new leadership and protocols. I instituted regular town halls where employees could raise concerns directly to executive leadership, and we created an independent ombudsman position to handle complaints without fear of retaliation. Employee surveys conducted 3 and 6 months after the incident showed significant improvements in trust and communication, though rebuilding the culture fully would take years. The media coverage evolved as more details emerged. Initial stories about corporate dysfunction gave way to more nuanced analyses of how individual bad actors can weaponize legitimate concerns about workplace culture for personal gain. Rachel Kim, the reporter who'd first covered Garrett's allegations, wrote a follow-up piece examining the broader implications for employee advocacy and corporate transparency. And Garrett himself became a cautionary tale in HR and management circles, a case study in how unchecked ambition and manipulative tactics can self-destruct spectacularly. I never saw Garrett Sullivan again after his termination. I heard through industry contacts that he struggled to find comparable employment, that his reputation had been damaged badly enough that most companies avoided him. He tried to reinvent himself as a consultant on workplace culture and employee rights, but the documented evidence of his fabrications made that positioning unsustainable. Last I heard, he'd left the industry entirely, gone into something unrelated to finance or business. The elevator rant that had triggered this entire cascade had cost him the career he'd been so desperate to advance. For me, the whole experience fundamentally changed how I approached leadership. I'd been guilty of a different kind of disconnection than what Garrett alleged, not arrogance or intentional dismissal, but insulation. I'd relied too much on formal channels and filtered reports, trusted too much that problems would reach me through proper escalation, assumed too much that my open-door policy was actually accessible to people who didn't feel comfortable walking through that door. The message boards had been full of fiction, but they'd also revealed real communication failures that I needed to own and address. I started doing quarterly walking tours of every department, scheduled open office hours where anyone could book time with me directly, created informal feedback mechanisms that bypassed the normal hierarchy. I made mistakes visible by sharing them in company communications and explaining how we were addressing them. I invited criticism and challenge in meetings, rewarded people who identified problems rather than hiding them. And I worked with Richard and his team to build an HR function that employees actually trusted, that would surface concerns early before they festered into crises. The board of directors, for their part, commissioned an independent review of governance and culture, implemented stronger oversight mechanisms, and actually thanked me for how I'd handled the situation. They'd been concerned initially. A CEO at the center of employee controversy is never good optics. But the evidence of Garrett's campaign and my decisive response satisfied them that the problem was isolated rather than systemic. My contract was renewed with strong support, and the company's performance continued to improve as the cultural healing progressed. 3 years later, I was in an elevator again, early morning, riding up to the executive floor. There were other people in the car, including a young analyst I didn't recognize. He was talking to a colleague about some project, and he mentioned something about executive leadership's decision-making. I tensed involuntarily, remembering Garrett, but then the analyst said, "I appreciate that they actually explain their reasoning now, even when the decisions are tough. Makes it easier to trust the process when you understand the thinking." His colleague agreed, and they exited on floor 12, and I continued up alone. That moment felt like vindication, not of me personally, but of the work we'd all done to rebuild trust and communication. Garrett Sullivan had tried to destroy my reputation with lies, but in doing so, he'd exposed real weaknesses in how we operated, forced us to become a better company than we would have been otherwise. His campaign had failed, his career had imploded, but his impact, perversely, had been constructive. We'd learned, we'd changed, and we'd proven that malicious intent ultimately can't survive transparency and accountability. I still wonder sometimes what might have happened if I'd identified myself in that elevator, if I'd turned around and said, "Hi, Garrett, I'm the incompetent CEO you're trashing. Want to discuss your concerns directly?" But I'm glad I didn't, because staying silent, listening, investigating, building a case based on evidence rather than ego, that was the right response. Leadership isn't about winning arguments or proving critics wrong in the moment. It's about creating systems and cultures where truth emerges, where problems get solved, where even the Garretts of the world can't hide behind manufactured narratives because reality is too well documented and too transparently shared. The guy in the elevator thought he was talking about an absent, disconnected CEO who'd never know what he said. He was wrong on multiple levels. But his wrongness taught me something valuable, that the distance between leadership and staff isn't measured in floors or org charts. It's measured in communication and trust, and the willingness to actually listen when people speak, even when, especially when, what they're saying is uncomfortable or critical, or makes you question your assumptions. So if you're ever in an elevator and you hear someone trashing their boss or their company or their leadership, consider that maybe that boss is standing right there listening. But more importantly, consider whether that boss has created an environment where people feel comfortable raising concerns directly instead of venting in elevators or on anonymous message boards. Because if the answer is no, then maybe the criticism is deserved, whether the specific allegations are true or not. And if the answer is yes, then maybe you're witnessing someone like Garrett building a narrative that serves themselves rather than truth. Either way, listen, pay attention. And understand that in the modern workplace, there are no truly private conversations, no anonymous complaints that can't eventually be traced, no reputations that can be destroyed or defended without evidence. The truth has a way of emerging, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but ultimately with clarity. And when it does, the people who've built their positions on lies and manipulation find themselves exactly where Garrett Sullivan ended up. Outside the building, career in ruins, looking for somewhere else to rebuild what they destroyed through their own choices. I was that CEO in the elevator, the one being trashed by an employee who didn't know I could hear every word. And I'm grateful for it, because it forced a reckoning that made me better at my job and made the company better for everyone who works here. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes, if you're willing to face them honestly and do the hard work of change. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.